I'm going to do this right on the spot. So I'll tell you a funny story. Last week, I asked Pat to preach because I've sat under his preaching, plenty, and I'm encouraged by his preaching. But when I asked him, we had a discussion, and one of the things I asked him was to wear long sleeves because he has tattoos on his arms, and I didn't want anybody to have the wrong impression. And that can, because, you don't know this guy, and then he looks a certain way, and it's like, and I just didn't want to do that to you guys. And so I asked him to do that. I didn't know at the time it was going to be 80, 90, 100 degrees, whatever it was. And after the service, he said, I did it. I took one for their team, and he sent me a picture of his shirt, and it was disgusting. So I'm sure that you probably noticed that. And so I appreciate him doing that. But I told him if I asked him to preach again, next time he can wear a tank top. So just give him. I didn't mean that, but yeah. So I just thought that was kind of funny. But also, I did want to let you know that if he ever does come back and preach and you see tattoos on his arms, don't be, super offended. That's just, it is what it is. But I thought that was funny. But I hope that the message was encouraging, and I'm glad to be back. So as I said, we're in Exodus 19, and I have I'm in the first 6 months of being a pastor here still, believe it or not. It's only been since March. And so we're still experimenting, right? So today, I wrote out, basically all of my sermon here. I've never done this before. So we'll see how this goes. And I also don't have a PowerPoint today. And I also want to try something that I'd like to do maybe more often than not. I'd like to give a challenge to the kids. We'll call it a word search challenge, which means you're going to search the word for something, okay? So I don't have a prize today because we're just testing this out. But here's my challenge to you. I'd like you to, at some point in this sermon, I'm going to give you the answer to this question. But are you ready for the question? So if you're, I don't know, say 18 and younger, 15 and younger, whatever. If you're young enough that you like to play games with kids, here's a challenge for the kids. The question is, where in the Bible does it say our God is a consuming fire? You need the book of the Bible, the chapter, and the verse, okay? And what I'd like to do is maybe every Sunday I can just issue a challenge to you to try and see if you are paying attention, I guess, during the sermon. If you can give me the answer, maybe I'll give you a prize. But we'll just test this out today and see if it's any fun. And I'd like to see how many kids can give me the answer to that question by the end of the sermon. So the question is, again, where in the Bible does it say our God is a consuming fire? All right? So everybody's in Exodus chapter 19, right? So from 16 through 18, we've been following the Israelites as they've left Egypt, they've crossed the Red Sea, but they're not to the Promised Land yet. They're just wandering wherever the Lord leads them by a pillar of cloud and fire. And as they've been wandering, following Moses' leadership under God, they have grumbled a lot, they've complained a lot, they've struggled. They've even wished that they could go back to Egypt. They even wished once that God would have just killed them in Egypt because Moses just wanted to bring them out in the wilderness to starve them to death. But now in chapter 19, they finally reached a little bit more permanent of a location. They are at Mount Sinai, and that's what we're going to look at today. In the book of Exodus, I've stated before that one of the key themes is that of God's self-disclosure. But it's God's self-disclosure by way of introduction, meaning that you could say anything in the Bible is God's self-disclosure. It's God revealing himself and who he is. So whether you're talking about what Paul has to say about Jesus being the only mediator in 1 Timothy, or some passage of Scripture in the Psalms, anywhere in Scripture is God revealing himself, so that's not unique. But what is unique, especially in the first 5 books of the Bible, is that God is revealing himself in kind of an introductory fashion. There's some firsts that happen in the first 5 books of the Bible. and today's no different. He's revealed himself to numerous people before the account that we'll look at today, and they've all been varied. He's revealed himself in numerous different kinds of ways. As the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 1, he says, in the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways. Some of those various ways thus far in the scriptures include visions like Abraham's in Genesis 15:1. God gave him a vision and spoke to him there, a promise. Also, another example of how God spoke was through angels, like regarding Sodom and Gomorrah, when there were angels there, but it says that Abraham stood there before the Lord, so God spoke to him through angels in that episode. Also, he's spoken in dreams, like Jacob's dream that he had of the ladder and the angels ascending and descending in Genesis chapter 28, 10 to 15. And he's spoken through messengers like Joseph was in Genesis 40. When he was speaking to Pharaoh and interpreting his dream for him, God was speaking to Pharaoh, this time through a messenger named Joseph. As God spoke in many ways, he also has communicated without speaking. How many know that when you speak to someone, you're speaking with your words, but you're also simultaneously communicating with other suggestions, right? With your body language, with your tone, with all the other ways that communication happens. Sometimes more is communicated than what is simply carried by the words. In today's passage, it happens to be one of those times where the Lord wants to communicate more than just the words to his people. He wants to leave a particular impression upon them that will define their entire relationship to him as a nation. So the stage is set for this special occasion, even in the first two verses, as we see Moses leading the people back to the place where his leadership story began and where their story was headed, Sinai. Chapter 19, verse 1, in the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, on the very day they came to the desert of Sinai. So just get that in your head that, sometimes we lose the time frames of these stories that we read. This is only a few months after everything that happened in Egypt, and they got delivered from that. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Remember, in chapter 3, verse 1, when Moses was tending to Jethro's flock, remember that story? He ran away from Egypt, and he went and hid in Midian, and then he's tending his father-in-law's flock. It said that he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. That's the same place that they're at now. Moses has been here before. That was where he would encounter God at the burning bush. So not only has Moses been to this place before, but he's encountered God at this place before. That was where he would encounter God at the burning bush. And remember that Moses doubted whether he was really the one to execute this plan. And God responded by giving Moses a sign to confirm that it really was the one true God who was sending him. So we remember this episode, right? Moses had a long debate with God about how he wasn't qualified to deliver the Israelites. The Israelites weren't going to believe that God sent him. The Israelites weren't, or even Pharaoh wouldn't believe that this God sent him. Even, Moses asks God, who should I tell them sent me? And so he's having this whole debate. Well, in the course of that debate with the Lord tells him, I'm going to give you a sign that it's really me that is really sending you. And here was the sign. This is in chapter 3, verse 12. God said, when you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. And now here we are in chapter 19, verse 2. Moses came back to this place where he's been before, but now he's brought all the Israelites with him. It turns out that God has showed up just as he said he would and used Moses just as he said he would. This has the makings of something extraordinary. So now from verse 3 through 8, We can hear what the Lord initially speaks to the people as well as the people's initial response, but I don't want to zoom in on that until next week. Next week, we'll look at what God spoke, and there's much that he spoke. But this week, we're focusing on the way in which he spoke, and we see the beginning of that in verse 9. So I'll go ahead and read through verses 3 to 8, but again, we'll focus more on the content of what God says next week. This week, we're just focusing on how he showed up and how he spoke, because it seems that the author here is very intent on keying the reader into the way in which God shows up. So we'll read from verse 3 to 8. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the house of Jacob and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. The people all responded together that we will do everything the Lord had said. So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. Now it says in verse 9, "The Lord said to Moses, I am going to come to you in a dense cloud, so that the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you." Then Moses told the Lord what the people had said. Moses, on the precipice of seeing the fulfillment of the sign to his promised leadership, which is that these people would be brought back to this mountain and would worship God, he's assured now that God will demonstrate to the people that Moses is uniquely authorized to be mediator for the people. This is a key point because the people up to this point in the story have had a terrible time following Moses' leadership, right? If you're following the story, it's been nothing but problems, nothing but trouble. From not believing that he was sent by God back in chapter 5, to doubting their full safety as Pharaoh pursued them in chapter 14, to complaining about food in chapter 16, verse 3, as they specifically blame Moses when they say, "You have brought us out into this desert to make us die of hunger." That was when they had said, "Look, you should have let us die in Egypt under God, but you, Moses, instead chose to bring us out here so that way we could die of hunger." So he's literally delivered these people and now has been accused by them as actually having murderous intentions. And then threatening him with death in chapter 17 for not providing water. Remember, Moses goes to the Lord and says, "These people are about to stone me." It's only in the battle against Amalek where they're forced to have to cooperate with Moses and then find safety. That was part of the lesson there in that story, is that it was only when in cooperation with Moses that they were going to be able to defeat that enemy. In verse 10 now, God gives specific directions for the people to follow just in order for them to be prepared for this upcoming visitation. You know this is something different. The cleanliness that God calls for from these people is representative of the moral purity he demands and the holiness with which he dwells. In verse 10, the command is, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and be ready by the third day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people." So now that the people understand, or at least Moses understands, that God is going to manifest himself in such a way to communicate to these people that Moses is the one authorized mediator between the two, Moses comes down and he commands the people to prepare for this day. It's going to be a manifestation of God in a way that they've never seen before. Remember, God has showed up in lots of different ways. It's not as though God has been removed the whole entire time and now all of a sudden he's going to intervene. God has intervened multiple times. The pillar of fire and cloud, remember that? The manna, the angel of the Lord. He's shown up in lots of different ways to these people. But so obviously this is going to be something that's even more spectacular, even more unique. It's interesting to note here the recognition of the sacred that people are called It's interesting to note here the recognition of the sacred that the people are called to. That is to say that these people, since God is going to show up in a unique way, they're expected to show up in a unique way. They need to wash up, to, mildly put it. That's a wild understatement. Even in our own day, while everything typically considered sacred is being flipped to be common or even profane, you still see traces of reverence. It's still the case that I just went to a wedding last week, as you know, and even at the wedding, everybody dresses up. Nobody's showing up in shabby clothes. Everybody is way more quiet. I mean, it was a total riot most of the time I was there, but when the bride's walking up, everybody's standing up. Nobody's sitting down slouched. There's a recognition of times and places and events that are supposed to be revered. So there still is some traces of that. And it's that type of reverence that these people are to show up to the mountain with when God shows up. There's a stubborn history of putting oneself together before an encounter with something of the transcendent and divine. That's one of the reasons why people still won't come to church, because they know to walk in this place, they have to put on their best to some degree, because that's what's expected. Now, I know that there's churches that that preach the come as you are message so ardently that they repel the saints and attract all the sinners. But the way that it should be is that this is a reverent place. This is a place of worship. This is not just a common house. It's not a gathering or a meeting like an Elks Club or like some other kind of meeting. This is the church where we come to worship, where we come to extol the excellencies. I keep thinking of that word from 1 Peter. To proclaim his excellencies. This is sacred ground in the sense that we're doing sacred things, and we need to approach it as such. I used to tell Levi when he was a kid, because he never wore clothes for like the first 7 years of his life. It was crazy. So he would make do with shorts and a tank top, just the least as possible, And I told him, if you were going to a basketball court, would you wear scuba diving gear? And he said, no. And I said, why? Because I'm not going scuba diving. And I give him examples like that. When you're going to church, you're not going to play basketball, so you don't wear your basketball clothes. You don't wear your football clothes. You're going to church, so you dress like you're going to church. Anyway, so back to this, though. These people are to adorn themselves and prepare themselves for what is to come, which is an encounter with the divine. Now, as I said, the Lord is about to make an indelible mark on these people as to who he is to them. This encounter will be life-threatening. Not exactly what you would expect when you're reading this story, I would think. I mean, this is a God that just saved them. That back in chapter 3 and 4 talked about how he heard the cries of his people. Remember that? So it sounds like he was moved out of compassion. He was moved out of care, out of concern. So why in this encounter is this going to be life-threatening? That's what it's going to be. An encounter with God that will be life-threatening. How so? Well, first, he commands that they stay away at penalty of execution in verses 12 and 13. This is what God tells Moses to tell the people. He says, put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, be careful that you do not go up the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. He shall surely be stoned or shot with arrows. Not a hand is to be laid on him. Whether man or animal, he shall not be permitted to live. Only when the ram's horn sounds a long blast may they go up to the mountain. Not only are these people commanded and disallowed from being able to climb the mountain, they're not even able to touch it. This is holy ground, and the Lord is going to make absolutely certain that they are constrained and restrained before him. Not only can they not touch the mountain, but it also says, don't even touch someone who touches the mountain. Thus, the command to either stone them or shoot them with arrows. You can't lay a hand on them. They're unclean, they're unholy, and they've defied the word of the Lord. This event was in HD and surround sound. They heard the crack of thunder clapping, seen the sight of lightning strikes flashing, smelled the smoke that billowed from the top of the mountain, and were disoriented by the shaking that had occurred. Verses 20 to 25 repeat the command that they better not try and breach the limitations Moses had set, but this time God himself is the danger. This is verse 20. Oh, I think I got ahead of myself. In verse 16 it says, "On the morning of the third day there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace. The whole mountain trembled violently, and the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. Then Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. The Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up, and the Lord said to him, 'Go down and warn the people so they do not force their way through to see the Lord, and many of them perish.'" Even God himself is the threat now. "Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them." So Moses said to the Lord, "The people cannot come up Mount Sinai because you yourself warned us, put limits around the mountain and set it apart as holy." The Lord replied, "Go down and bring Aaron up with you, but the priests and the people must not force their way through to come up to the Lord, or he will break out against them." So Moses went down to the people and told them. God himself here in this section may break out against them, it says. They were to be nowhere near the mountain until the trumpet blast, and then they could come as far as the limitations. So they were supposed to be off in the distance, and then they could come closer to the foot of the mountain, but there was limitations, and they could not breach beyond that. This encounter was staggering. If you look forward to the next chapter, in chapter 20, verse 18, it says that the people trembled with fear. Again, this was not a cozy invitation to approach the Lord casually. It says they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance, and they sent Moses on their behalf. Let me just read it. "When the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance, and they said to Moses, 'Speak to us yourself, and we will listen.'" Wow, look at these people finally falling in line. "Moses, please speak to us. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." This encounter with the Lord struck fear and terror in these people. And I just think of some of these elements, and it's easy to imagine. If you've been outside, I've worked outside. I remember, lots of different occasions, like as a mailman, but also I remember working for an old pastor of mine and on a ladder, and lightning struck, and all you could think about is when's the next one, and where's it gonna hit, and it's always kind of terrifying. Not because of what it is. I mean, obviously, lightning, that's got to hurt, obviously. But what's more terrifying to me is the unpredictability of it. There's no buildup to it. The thunder comes after. It'd be nice if the thunder hit, and then you knew, scientifically, there's 10 seconds from thunder to lightning. And then, it wouldn't help. I can't stop it, but it would just help to anticipate it. But it's it's just gloomy. And out of nowhere, boom. It's that type of terror they must have been feeling because again, everything explained here is like a volcano erupting, but it's not just the sheer force of it, it's the unpredictability of it. It's the uncontrolled nature of it. They're completely helpless. It's terrifying. They didn't want to approach this terribly, dreadfully threatening God. It was not attractive. They were there because they were commanded, but they didn't run up there with interest. They actually tried to distance themselves. In the New Testament, even Moses, it says in Hebrews chapter 11, that even Moses himself was trembling with fear. But it turns out that this fear that caused these people to want to actually recoil and retreat was by design. In verse 20, we get the purpose of this whole dramatic encounter. In chapter 20, verse 20, Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid," which is always comforting when there's a volcano erupting in front of you. "God has come to test you so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning." It's so that he may test them and so that the fear of God may keep them from sinning. It's this inescapable intimidation that will operate as the grounding for the commands that are to follow. It's interesting that even in chapter 20, that's where the 10 Commandments are, but that it comes after this context is set of this gloomy cloud and fire. He's got to set the mood, so to speak, in the most terrifying way. These Israelites have been the recipients of the benefits of God's power. They got to see what he did to Pharaoh and all the Egyptians. But now they're being confronted with the same right hand and outstretched arm that saved them. What if that strong arm that brought a darkness that could be felt was turned against you, Israel? They're being confronted with this might that has worked on their behalf and they've taken so for granted. Two things are unmistakably clear so far in this passage. One, Moses has unique authorization before the Lord. That's evidenced by him going up to the Lord and coming back from the Lord, and going up to the Lord and coming back from the Lord, going right into the cloud, even if he's trembling. And two, that the Lord is an uncontrollably powerful force that is to be revered. This episode is to be a living memory in the nation of Israel as they go forward. And so Moses reminds them of this as he repeats the law to them in Deuteronomy chapter 4, 9 through 12. You could turn there with me if you want, but you don't have to. We know that Deuteronomy is Moses' second giving of the law. This is right before they're about to go into the promised land, and he's reminding them of what he's been through with them and what Israel has been through. One of the things he reminds them of is not just what God says, but also what he does in this very encounter that we're reading about. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 9 to 12, he tells them this: "Be careful, watch yourselves closely so that you do not forget what? So that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen." Of course, plenty of times in Deuteronomy, he reminds them to not forget of what their ears have heard, of what God's word is. But here he reminds them, don't forget what you saw with your own eyes. Do not forget the things your eyes have seen, or let them slip from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to their children after them. Just side note, if you've ever thought to yourself, how come God doesn't just show up more often? Why can't he always be showing up in fire and cloud on top of a mountain? And how come he can't always be transfiguring, up in the Willapa Hills where we can see Moses and Elijah next to him or something? How come he can't just do that all the time so that way we know he's present? It's always been God's style that he'll do something dramatic, and then he'll pass that down as a story to be told generation after generation after generation after generation. That's what Moses is telling these people. Moses was there on Mount Sinai when this all occurred, but now he can't just summon God to do it again for this next generation of people. No, he tells them that you need to tell these your kids and their kids about what you've seen. This will be a story now that will be told over and over again. Teach them to your children and to their children after them. Remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when he said to me, assemble the people before me to hear my words, so that they may learn to revere me as long as they live in the land. Let me read it again. Remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when he said to me, assemble the people before me to hear my words, so that they may learn to revere me as long as they live in the land, and may teach them to their children. It's that dramatic event that should have sustained a level of fear that was generational, that would establish them in the land and keep them from ever becoming like the pagans that they drove out. You came near and stood at the foot of the mountain while it blazed with fire to the very heavens with black clouds and deep darkness. Then the Lord spoke to you out of the fire. You heard the sound of words but saw no form. There was only a voice. And then he goes on to explain what happens next with them given the Ten Commandments. He reiterates it again later in chapter 4 of Deuteronomy, verses 32 to 36. He says, ask now about the former days, long before your time, from the day God created man on the earth. Ask from one end of the heavens to the other, has anything so great as this ever happened, or has anything like it ever been heard of? Has any other people heard the voice of God speaking out of fire as you have and lived? Has any God ever tried to take for himself one nation out of another nation by testings, by miraculous signs and wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, or by great and awesome deeds like all the things the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? You were shown these things so that you might know that the Lord is God. Besides him, there is no other. From heaven, he made you hear his voice to discipline you. On earth, he showed you his great fire, and you heard his words from out of the fire. One more time, in chapter 5 of Deuteronomy, verses 23 to 29. It seems like this is a really big deal. He mentions this episode again. When you heard the voice out of the darkness, while the mountain was ablaze with fire, all the leading men of your tribes and your elders came to me, and you said, the Lord our God has shown us his glory and his majesty, and we have heard his voice from the fire. Today we have seen that a man can live even if God speaks with him. But now, why should we die? This great fire will consume us, and we will die if we hear the voice of the Lord our God any longer. For what mortal man has ever heard the voice of the living God speaking out of the fire as we have and survived? Go near and listen to all that the Lord our God says. Then tell us whatever the Lord our God tells you. We will listen and obey you, Moses. The Lord heard you when you spoke to me, and the Lord said to me, what did the Lord say to you, Moses? Let's hear it. I have heard what this people said to you, Moses. Everything they said was good. Oh, that, it says, oh, that their hearts would be inclined to fear me and keep all my commands always, so that it might go well with them and their children forever. But let me ask this. Okay, so it's clear that God wanted to scare the pants off all the Israelites, and he did it. You may be thinking, as a New Testament Christian, especially in our context, is fear the only factor in a relationship with the Lord? Doesn't 1 John chapter 4, verse 18 and 19 say this? There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. Because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. Therefore, don't fear God, right? Wrong. But it's true. 1 John 4, 18 and 19 does say that. So I'll close with this. Let's all flip together to Hebrews chapter 12 and see the way that the author of Hebrews makes this connection. Hebrews chapter 12, starting in verse 18. We know that the audience here that the author of Hebrews is writing to is on the brink of apostatizing. They're on the brink of turning away from the gospel message that they've heard, believing it to some degree, actually even suffering a bit and standing alongside those who have been persecuted. But now at this point, they're it seems like they're withdrawing, and they're starting to become more private with their faith so as to avoid any kind of persecution. And the author, over and over and over again, calls them to boldness in their faith and to not retreat from the people of God, but to continue to press in and hold on to the faith that they've been given. And so he says in verse 18, you, audience in the New Testament who's heard the gospel and believed in Jesus, you have not come to a mountain that can be touched and that is burning with fire. Sounds familiar? To darkness, gloom, and storm. To a trumpet blast, or to such a voice speaking words that those who heard it begged that no further word be spoken to them, because they could not bear what was commanded. They said, this was the command, if even an animal touches the mountain, it must be stoned. They couldn't bear that type of limitation. The sight was so terrifying that Moses said, I am trembling with fear. I am trembling with fear. The author here is going to make a contrast because he just described everything we just read in Exodus 19, but he tells his audience, you haven't come to that mountain. But you have come to Mount Zion. Zion, theologically, throughout the Old Testament and New Testament, is built upon Jerusalem in an earthly sense as well as in a heavenly sense. But let's keep reading. To the heavenly Jerusalem, that is the city of God. That's the city that God placed his name in the temple. The city of the living God. You have come to thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly. You see the mountain that can be touched in contrast to the mountain that can't be touched? The heavenly mountain, as it were. The place where God truly resides. Not just a representation, not the one that can be touched, but one that is intangible. You see the crowds or the sounds, I should say, of thunder and probably explosions and the earthquake that happened, which would be terrifying, in contrast here now to what? The joyful assembly of thousands of angels. In verse 23, to the church of the firstborn whose names are written in heaven, as opposed to the congregation that stood there at a distance from the mountain. Now you are among those who have their names written in the Lamb's Book of Life. You have come to God, the judge of all men, to the spirits of righteous men made perfect. That's referring to saints that have already died and gone on to glory. To Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, not just Moses, who he himself even is trembling before Mount Horeb, but now Jesus, a better mediator, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. The contrast here is the sheer terror that accompanied the mountain that they were at Sinai, Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, which is the same area, versus the joy and fulfillment and comfort and embrace and welcome and invitation and solidity that there is in the true city of God, which is the heavenlies, which is established even now. Jesus is right now reigning at the right hand of the Father. And Ephesians would tell us that we're even reigning with him. We have a place with him. He went on in order to prepare a place for us. That's all secured with us. And as Pat preached last week, there's even a joyful celebration that happens in heaven when one sinner repents. That type of picture is what's being depicted here for us saints who have come to place our faith in Christ. So if that's the case, if we're not in the assembly that shrunk back from God because he was so terrible, but we're actually of the congregation that can come boldly into the throne room of grace, then we dare not retreat. We dare not drop our faith, or we dare not act like those at Mount Sinai that would try to distance ourselves from the Lord in the way that he has revealed himself. And he's revealed himself now through his son, Jesus Christ. And that's what the author of Hebrews goes on to make the point here. That's what he goes on to encourage his audience in. In verse 25, he says, "See to it that you do not refuse him who speaks, like they did at Sinai." Don't speak to us, God. Speak to Moses, and then Moses can come speak to us. They were too scared of him. Don't resist. Don't refuse. Don't try to escape what God is speaking now. And at the beginning of Hebrews, remember I started the sermon by saying that God has revealed himself in various times, in various ways. Well, the rest of that passage says, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. And here he's calling them to not refuse him who speaks. If they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, did they escape? No, they didn't. God was inescapable, even though they tried to resist him, or they at least they were afraid, I should say. But he says, if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, how much less will we if we turn away from him who warns us from heaven? At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. The words once more indicate the removing of what can be shaken, that is, created things, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, now here it is, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe. Let us do that. Let us be thankful that we're not operating before the Lord in sheer terror like they were at Mount Sinai. Let us be thankful for that. That Jesus himself said that we can call God our Father. You understand that's a New Testament privilege, right? We can call him our Father, and we're thankful for that. We're children of God. And let us worship God acceptably with reverence and awe. Why? Well, because Hebrews chapter 12, verse 29 says, our God is a consuming fire. Wink, wink, kids. Let's close in, actually, I'm going to invite the ushers to come forward so we can take communion. And then we'll close in prayer at the end of the service. So as we come to the Lord's Supper, this is also a privilege. It's an amazing example of God's presence among his people, even sharing a meal. Of course, we know this is representative of the Last Supper that Jesus had with his disciples. And I am going to read the passage from 1 Corinthians chapter 11. There are lots of things that if I can just speak really practically, that in our life can make us feel distant from the Lord. Obviously, sin being the chief cause of that. I would encourage you, saints, brothers and sisters, if that's you today, and you've placed your faith in Christ, you've been walking with him, but you feel estranged from him, or alone, or you're hiding in your sin even as we speak, don't do that. Don't stay away from him. Don't cut yourself off from the love of God.